ACNFers got a crushing headache. This week's podcast is brought to you by disconsolateness, a state or spell of low spirits. You wake up in the morning, the alarm clock goes off, and you are in a state of disconsolateness, unabating, unrelenting.
I was like, no prompts? Like, what are the themes we're going to explore here? Like, I need some inspiration and motivation. And Joe was like, I never had to tell my reporters that. They just went out and wrote the story and weren't, too, I guess, moralizing about their own work.
Oh, hey, CNFers, it's CNF Pod, the creative nonfiction podcast, the show where I speak to badass people about telling true stories, but then again, you knew that. I'm Brendan O'Mara. Awesome. Count them, three people on the podcast today. We have the father-daughter combo of Lucy Sexton and Joe Sexton, and she calls him Joe. It's just a thing that they do. You'll read about it in the piece. I don't bring it up in the podcast. I once started calling my dad Walter, and the first time I did it, he was like, kind of gave me side eyes, like, I'll allow it. I did it one more time, and you could see the steam starting to come out of his nose and ears, and I did it a third time, and he lit into me. He's like, I am your father. Lucy and Joe are on the show to talk about their Atavist feature, not just co-bylined, not just co-written, but more like a duet with individual voices braided together like a rope toy. Lucy was working on a documentary about the Iranian hostage situation following and during the Iranian Revolution, the late 70s, early 80s. While at the same time, Joe, current day 2021, while on assignment in Libya, was taken hostage himself for several days. Yeah, I know. Piece is titled Held Together at magazine.atavist.com. Consider subscribing. I don't get any kickbacks, so you know my recommendation is true, and my advocacy for everything that Sayward Darby and Jonah Ogles and the team behind every issue of blockbuster journalism that Atavist does, it comes from a good place. While I have your undivided attention, I will be moving my newsletter already, oh my God, from Substack to Beehive. It's a more traditional newsletter delivery service. Listen, I don't trust Substack long term. Maybe I'm just getting paranoid about social media in general, but think about it. When you sign up for something free, it's never free. I always get a bit weary, and I think they are... I don't think they're so different from other social media companies. And I suspect that if you keep offering a free product like I do, and I wouldn't get people to upgrade for anything on that platform, I suspect you're going to get squeezed out or strong-armed into some obscure corner of their sandbox. And they're going to just kind of bury you. And you guessed it, their algorithm is going to be doing that. And they're going to privilege the people who have paid things because paid subscribers, the commission off of that subsidizes what Substack does. So make sure you're heading over to BrendanO'Mara.com. Hey, for show notes, blog posts. So that's going to happen. It already has. I wrote one called How Not to Write a Book. And to sign up for the Rage Against the Algorithm newsletter, first of the month, no spam. You can't beat it. We're going to keep raging against the algorithm because that's just what we do. If you dig the show, you might want to consider sharing it with your various networks and the people you know who you know will get some value of it. We still want to grow the pie and get the CNF thing into the brains of other CNFers who need the juice. And don't we all need the juice? I have like a leaky bucket in my juice bucket. And sometimes I get a nice note from someone, and it's nice. It's nice. You need the juice. This podcast can provide juice. The show's listenership, I don't know. Sometimes it feels like it's going up, and then other times it feels like it's fucking tanking. I guess my charming personality might have overstayed its welcome in the podcast space. We'll always take nice reviews on Apple Podcasts, so the wayward CNFer might say, well, shit, I'll give that a shot. Yeah, and by the way, deleted at Brendan O'Mara Twitter account. See ya. Go away, son. I might delete the podcast one too, but then again, I might not. Like it's kind of like a placeholder, because sometimes you find contact information on X. Sorry, Twitter. It's X. I don't see myself adding another social media account. I'm turning into something of a crank of late. Like I really feel like I'm just like folding in on myself in a lot of ways. But that's a good place from which to write a book, and I am writing a book, lest you forgot. But I don't think it matters, social media. And watching people's cries for attention and trying to get that coveted attention and toehold so you have a platform through which you can be more attractive to sell your memoir or your essay collection or your biography or your work of narrative journalism. I get it, but I don't think it matters. I don't. Doesn't do anything for my mood when I see people just like they're doing this and they're doing these videos, and people who podcast are like, all right, now I guess a video's a thing, so I'm just gonna be doing that now, and I'm not on board. I have this PR40 microphone before me with this metal pop filter, a boom arm, Hindenburg in your attention. This is what matters. And the newsletter, which you can now sign up for at BrendanO'Mara.com. Hey. I want to give a shout out. We got 2 new patrons, and anytime I get patrons on the pod, I got to recognize you. I want to say big thanks to Simon Cole. I want to say thanks to Kim Costigan for upping her pledge, and I want to thank Jamie Curry, who is on board now. 2 from the UK. It's kind of crazy. This is an international enterprise, CNF pod. So thanks to everyone there who decided to join in our little podcast to throw a few bucks in the coffers to help it to help it live. And for Kim there for upping her pledge 25%. That's pretty great. Shout out to Athletic Brewing, the best damn non-alcoholic beer out there. Not a paid plug, but I am a brand ambassador, as some of you know. And I want to celebrate this amazing product. So tasty. It's got, I hate the word mouthfeel. I hate it. But what's great about it is it doesn't taste like watered down beer. It actually has that kind of, a richness that IPAs have. Mouthfeel. If you head to athleticbrewing.com and use the promo code BrendanO20 at checkout, you get a nice little discount on your first order. Free wave is my favorite. I don't get any money, and they are not an official sponsor of the podcast, but I do get points towards swag or like t-shirts and beer. I do have to pay for shipping, but it's nice that I can accumulate points and get beer at redeem those points for beer and then pay $5 for shipping. And then I have some libations that are lacking in what makes them libated to give it a shot. All right, first off is Editor-in-Chief Sayward Darby. This is her final visit to the show for 3 months. The parent company of the Atavist mandates a 3-month sabbatical once every 5 years, so I'm told. So she's been forced to take a quarter year off. For the type A mind, I don't suspect it'll go well. I joked with her. I'm like, so you have like 11 weeks to like decompress and then 1 to enjoy. And I think she laughed. But she might not have. She probably didn't. Anyway, we start with Sayward, and I asked her, what advice can you possibly give to an upstart journalist, given that the paths that got the elders to where they are don't really work anymore. Riff.
It's such a good question, and I actually was at a dinner the other night, and there was this lovely person who used to work at Lit Hub and now works at Brooklyn Museum, where they're putting together a project of like an in-house magazine, basically. And we were talking about being asked these types of questions. And I said, I never really know what to say, because what worked for me might not work now for anyone, just because the world has changed, the industry has changed so much. And I remember getting advice from, people of Joe's generation who, their advice was just kind of go and do,
Yeah.
which, is not the easiest prospect now, financially and otherwise. But anyway, so this person I was talking to said, I agree that it's really hard. And I too don't quite know what to say. And then they said, what I try to focus on instead of, here's how you get a foothold. Here is how you start making money. She tries to talk more about like what principles do you think are important to guide any career, like whether you ultimately do find a foothold at one of the last standing newspapers, or you're a independent blogger, or I don't know, you're doing you're a freelance long form journalist or whatever. And talking about like what you have valued and what other people have taught you to value, because I think that those things are sort of immutable ultimately to like having a good career and being a good person. And I'd never really thought about it that way. And I thought that was a really profound way of thinking about it. And it made me think back on, people who've been my mentors, teachers, guides, whether they realized they were those people or not. And I realized ultimately what I have taken away from them and then tried to pay forward and, certainly apply every day in my own work is, what I think is a good and right way of doing my job, and how to treat other people, how to treat the material, how to treat the work. And so I don't know if that's a cop out of an answer, but I think that, on the one hand, things are constantly shifting and changing from a industry standpoint, but there are certain things that I don't think change and that anybody should try to apply. So, I mean, something as basic as like, don't be an asshole and don't work with assholes, if you can avoid it. Or, have respect for yourself and don't ever do work that is not compensated, and protect people around you, protect your sources, things. I mean, I could go on and on about this, but it's funny you asked this because I've been now noodling on this question ever since I had this conversation with this very wise person at this dinner party. So yeah, I kind of think that's how I'm going to start having those conversations. Like I'm a bit of a beacon of doom and gloom, I think sometimes, where I'm like, I don't know, guys, maybe media won't even exist in a few years, much less America. Like that's kind of my mindset a lot of the time. And I realize that's not a terribly helpful one, as opposed to thinking the nuts and bolts, kind of thinking from a macro perspective about the things that shouldn't change, to make for a good career, to make for a better industry, that kind of thing. So I don't know if that is a good answer or a bad answer, but that's where I'm at.
Yeah. Well, it's like, I think a lot of times we get really hung up on the medium of it, and the medium has always changed, but what hasn't changed are the skills of good reporting and journalism. It's just accuracy and the ethics of it, just making sure you're a solid interviewer and a solid writer, and basic tenets of research, of which even my research muscle isn't very good because Google has made us so lazy. And it's
Right.
like being able to track down things in a more analog way can get you some really rich stuff that a lot of other people are either ignorant to or lazy. And so it's, those things, if you like those core skills, if those are solid, then I don't know if you'll be able to make a living, but at least what you do is going to be rock solid. And then, if you focus on those skills, then maybe it does parlay into something that is more sustainable.
Those kinds of things, skills, because I do think we as a society, as young people in this society, often really prioritize, well, how can I put myself in a position to make money? Which, I mean, great, we all need to make money. But I think like in some ways, like starting from the standpoint of like, how can I do my job well is, and well can encompass a lot of different things. It can encompass, research you're talking about. It can, encompass particular skills, within that, writing, editing, whatever. But then also, like I said, sort of values, being a good person, having principles that you stand by as a journalist, I don't know, learning from people that you respect, like all these different things. And I'm not trying to be too kumbaya about it, but I do think that, at the end of the day, you have to be nimble, right? Like things are constantly shifting. What worked even a year ago, 5 years ago, might not work now. And so you need to be light on your feet. You need to be willing to, do what you, I think too, I guess what I was about to say, and this is a better way of putting it, is like, I think that the lines between like journalistic work and non-journalistic work have changed a lot, even just in the time that I've been a journalist. Whereas once upon a time, it was like, well, if you step away from journalism to do something else to make money, you can never come back, kind of thing,
Yeah,
and that's really not the case anymore. And like so many people now do all kinds of things on the side, or for periods of time to support, what it is that they're passionate about, from a writing standpoint. And I think, figuring out what makes you happy in that regard, or at least what makes you not unhappy
yeah.
in that regard, and willing to be nimble and also hold on to whatever, your values are. I think that, I don't know. That's how I'm going to be shaping these conversations going forward, Brendan. And I'm going to get better at talking about it.
Yeah. Yeah. And not to belabor the point, but it is such a drag that, you might have to like write for brands and do content marketing to subsidize journalism, your own journalism. Whereas like, here's this core, like cornerstone of like a democracy of journalism, the fourth estate. It's basically built into the Bill of Rights. And yet it's still something that is not really sustainable, certainly these days, to like make a living. Just start at a newspaper and work your way up. It just,
Right.
and it's like you see people getting laid off at ESPN. It's like, what other industry? It's like the more skilled and the better you are at your job, the more vulnerable you are to being laid off. It is that drives me insane. It just blows my mind.
Right. No, I think that's absolutely right. And it's very frustrating. And trust me, again, I'm mostly doom and gloom about this, but I try not to be doom and gloom with young people, because we do need young people to, continue doing this work. And so, thinking through, talking through experiences, and, talking about what it's okay to compromise and what it's not okay to compromise, if that makes sense. Yeah, I don't know. Speaking less from a here's how you do it, and more here are some, bumpers, if you will, on the bowling alley.
Yeah.
That, are gonna be there no matter, or should be there no matter what. Like always join a union, work for your union, like respect your union, I think all of these, things that, especially when you can feel a little out at sea as a young person trying to figure out your way through a, very turbulent industry, having sort of these guideposts can be really helpful.
Nice. And and in this piece, for this month's Atavist with Lucy and Joe, it's when you just say that, you're like, oh, here's a co-byline. And you did that with Sean and Lee several months ago. They did this really rollicking piece that basically took place in Germany, and that had more of the co-byline thing, where it did seem seamless. Two guys doing the work, very sort of uniform in its telling. But this is more of a braided piece. And so talk a little bit about the unique challenges to this piece, given that it's not only co-byline, but really it's like two different essays braided together.
Yeah, so the origin of this story kind of goes back a few years, actually, because Joe has pitched The Atavist a few times, and in one case the story didn't work out because we had just run a very similar story, literally like right when he pitched that story, and he ended up writing it for Publica, where he worked at the time, and it was an amazing story. And then he pitched the story that eventually became his book, because he was kind of, working through what he wanted it to be. And he and I talked a little bit about it, and he said, ultimately, I think this is a book. And in the course of that conversation, I remember, this was May of 2021, he kind of went silent for a few weeks. And I was like, oh, well, I don't know what's going on, but, he'll get back to me when he gets back to me. And then he sent me this email that said something like, I'm back from this reporting trip to Libya. Things were crazy. I would have to go back and find the exact language. But point being, it was incredibly, like, underplaying the situation in the most like in the most insane way. I had no idea at the time what had happened because he wasn't really telling people. It wasn't really public information. And then fast forward to late 2022, and he and I were both at the ceremony for the DART Awards for the coverage of trauma. The Atavist had won, and the Outlaw Ocean Project had, I can't remember if they were a runner-up, honorable mention, like whatever it was, for the work that Joe and Ian and Pierre and Mia had been doing in Libya. And he spoke on this panel and he talked about being taken hostage. And I was like, what? You got taken hostage? Like somehow I had just completely missed this. And then, so we spoke afterward and he said, I'd love to talk to you at some point about pitching some ideas again. And then we had coffee a few months later and he told me, he was like, I have this idea where my daughter, who happened to be working or producing a documentary about the Iran hostage crisis at the exact moment that I was taken hostage, we have this idea of maybe writing a piece together about that experience. And I was like, that sounds really fascinating. I, would love to hear more about it. And then, again, fast forward a few months and they actually sent a fully written draft. So it came in this braided form where it's like Lucy talking, Joe talking, Lucy talking, Joe talking. But there were a couple things I really liked about it. I mean, first of all, it felt like in some ways they were speaking to each other as much as they were speaking to the reader. And I thought that was really special. And then there are these really lovely, like, literary moments of almost overlap in the piece where you realize like one of them is seeing something from their vantage and the other person is seeing it from their vantage. And so there's repetition, I guess is what I'm trying to say, in the piece, but it works really well because you're actually seeing it from different sides. And I thought that was really special. And then also just, there's the wild, coincidence of what Lucy was doing work-wise when her father was taken hostage. But then they have this, really moving, complicated backstory as father and daughter. And I think they do a really nice job of, weaving that aspect of things into the story. And I'm trying to remember, they sent a fully written draft and I had some suggestions mostly for like the last, I would say, third of it, to, I think, add a section each, and divide some other things up just to kind of work on the rhythm as much as anything else. But I don't know, we've never done a piece like this. I think it works really well. I think that the personal relationship is what makes it work really well. And I'm excited for people to read it because I hadn't really thought about it until this moment, but you're absolutely right about sort of the generational difference. And I think that, they're each coming to this work from such different points in time. But at the same time, I think there is something. Joe worked at the New York Times for forever, worked at ProPublica, which is, obviously an incredible organization, and then kind of strikes out in the freelance world. And I think there's something to be said for what this story tells us about the dangers of, it's dangerous to be a journalist, period, in a lot of the world. But here too, it's like, you put together what is essentially a freelance outfit. And, when you're taken hostage, for instance, you don't necessarily have, institutional backing protocols. There were protocols, but anyway, I don't want to give too much away and I'm rambling and not sounding terribly coherent, but I think that there is sort of this like undercurrent in the story about the state of journalism and how it has shifted. And in some ways, like Joe and Lucy, like riding those currents together. And in ways they maybe didn't expect. And I think Joe especially does a really nice job of, talking about how his career followed, something of a traditional newspaper path. And then, late in the game, relatively speaking, he went off that path, and, started trying new things and learned a lot in the process, to put it lightly. So yeah, I don't know. It's a really special piece. And I think they did a really, really nice job with it. And it's nice. Their writing styles are very, complementary. Like, I don't think they're the same at all. But they're very complementary.
Yeah. And just from the editor side of the table, and the fact that they sent you something that was, I won't say fully formed, but definitely like a draft. what challenges did that present you to make sure everything felt harmonious?
I wouldn't say challenges per se. They were easy to edit. I mean, they're both pros. They like to be edited. And so I wouldn't say challenges exactly. One of the things, and this often happens when we have a more personal story, I try to gauge what people's comfort level is digging into certain issues. Because especially when somebody's like, this is the story I want to tell, if I, as an editor, see a dimension that I would really like to flesh out more, I want to make sure that that's something the person is comfortable with. They seemed totally comfortable with it. And actually, one of the most helpful moments in the process was I talked to Lucy on the phone, and early on, because I know Joe, he and I have communicated many times, but I'd never met Lucy, and so she and I got on the phone. She wanted to talk about some things related to the Iran hostage project, just to explain how she wanted to characterize it, etc. Anyway, and in the course of this, she ended up actually telling me various things that wound up in the story. Sort of stories about her childhood. There's this one incredible detail that comes up about how she got mad at Joe the way he edited like a third grade homework assignment.
And that ties
And
into the end of the piece too.
exactly. And so like that was not originally in the piece. And it was one of those things, she's telling me this detail, and I was like, that's incredible. And like a really like fun, like only the child of a writer would have this experience. And I think it said something about their relationship. It's not a challenge at all, but just kind of figuring out how to, like, what's not there and how do I find it. And I'm sure there's more. Of course, there's more. They've lived long, rich lives. Just having posing questions with the knowledge that I don't actually know what the answers are. Is there more we can say about this? Is there more we can say about this? What about an example from childhood that might, reflect this theme or whatever? And so sort of asking these almost broad questions, not factual ones, right? Like I'm not asking, well, when did this happen and why? Although there were certainly those types of questions, as there always are in edits. It was more sort of, okay, let's think about this thematically and maybe dig into, your biography and find something that might reflect that theme. And that's a very different, way of editing as opposed to, I don't know, define what this means. Or, can we timestamp this? Or, have we thought about a kicker for this section? Like just very different kinds of almost sort of like personal psychological questions. But it's fun to work on those types of stories.
Nice. And it's been nice over the years to see various co-bylined and co-produced pieces. It was like Annalise and Zahara, Lee and Sean, you and Ariel for the podcast, and now it's like the father-daughter combo of Joe and Lucy. So it's really cool to how you've over the last couple years been able to showcase the different dynamism of co-produced and co-bylined and co-written pieces. So I'm excited for people to get to experience this kind of collaboration that you've been able to put together.
Yeah, no, and thank you for saying that, because I do think those are all very different stories.
Yeah, very.
Not just subject matter wise, but in terms of what does it mean for two people to be working on this? Like you obviously, Sean and Lee's piece about Putin and his support of neo-Nazis in Germany decades ago. That is a piece. It's seamless, right? There are two people writing it, but it is the same voice throughout, which is obviously, its own kind of challenge. And here we have two voices that are very distinct because they're, each one writes a section and they go back and forth. But at the same time, they are not actually separate stories, right? They are the same story woven together from different perspectives. And then you have, Zahara and Annalise. And I think in that case, you have a writer and a videographer. Like you have people working in sort of two different media to convey a story. And then, the podcast was its own sort of unusual situation, but you have, Ariel kind of doing the nitty gritty reporting, describing, and then I'm sort of doing like the high level, like, reminders of history and, not talking to people so much as like narrating something. And those are all, yeah, really, really different ways of doing a joint project. So yeah, I'm excited for people to read this one. I think it's really special if you are a father, if you are a daughter. I can imagine how this story will feel really special.
Fantastic. Well, Sayward, as always, thanks for coming on and to kind of tease out this piece and to talk a little shop. So we're going to kick it over to Joe and Lucy now, and just best of luck with your time off now going forward.
Oh, thank you so much. I'll talk to you in November.
That's cool. Enjoy your sabbatical, Sayward. My goodness. I hope you're able to relax, get some things done, unplug. And I know she's traveling the world, and she's not a particularly fond. Let's just say, let me rephrase it. She's not particularly fond of flying, but that doesn't stop her from gallivanting around the world, and she's going to have a good time out there. I wish you the best, and we'll see you in November. Next up, now batting, Lucy Sexton, who is a documentary filmmaker and writer, and Joe Sexton, who is Lucy's father, longtime sports writer, and worked on the Metro desk at the New York Times for a bit. Freelancer these days. ProPublica was on a team that won the Pulitzer Prize with ProPublica, and he wanted to test his mettle by working by going overseas to work on some important international reporting, and really could not have gone worse. I mean, I guess it could have, but it's about as bad as it gets. And Lucy and Joe, they write so wonderfully about it, and it was, in the end, it was Joe's idea to do this. And we start at the point of when he knew he was ready to take this on. Like when you came back to the States after this horrible ordeal, like when did you know you were ready to write about it?
I don't know. I think actually, and I'm not trying to be cute here or whatever, but there's a scene at the end of the story where I joined Lucy at a screening for the HBO series Hostages, and sitting in a theater with former hostages from Iran, with I think 4 different directors who worked on the series, with former State Department officials who worked to free them, sitting there next to Lucy, and the lights go down, and you're about to see your child's work up there. I think it just struck me like we should tell our story. It's unusual. It could be interesting, and it'll be I think a rewarding act of trust between the two of us that will be good for us in our lives together.
And this is a completely different kind of braid. It is definitively 2 voices, 2 vantage points, 2 points of view. So for the pair of you, how did you come to this form of telling this braided story?
Well, a couple of things. One is, from the time I got back from Libya, I was always pretty uncertain how much I wanted to write about what had happened, if anything. We were mainly focused on publishing the story that ultimately ran in the New Yorker in November of 2021. And once that was done, and for that piece, I actually asked not to be named in it, in part because it just felt like a distraction to me, and also my 2 youngest girls, who were then 11, or not yet 11. I didn't want them to. I have never told them what happened, and so I didn't want them to, get asked by somebody's parent at a soccer game or something. So I had put off the idea of even writing about it for a long time. That once Lucy's documentary project was done, and we had gotten together in Manhattan for the sort of screening of the Hostages series, I thought, maybe I felt like I could write something about it. And Lucy and I have always wanted to do a project together. whether that's work on a book or work on a documentary. Or so I proposed to Lucy, would she, consider or be interested in trying to write a, a jointly write a piece. But I think it was clear to the both of us. I'll let Lucy speak to it as well. That the only way to do it would be to do it in kind of alternating chapters of our own voices. It would be hard to imagine it otherwise. And I think we both recognize that it would be unusual and maybe distinctive in some way. But I'll let Lou talk about it too.
I think that's a good setup in terms of like where we first started with the piece. Maybe like as you'll see in the piece, we talk about maybe my stubbornness as like the child of a writer, growing up being like my voice is important, and I guess that's still stayed true. And so I think one, just creatively, especially when you're writing with someone, you know, in your like immediate family, I think it's always like best to try to respect each other's voices and writing styles and versions of the story. But I think another thing behind it was just, I think some of the strength of the story was just kind of in the strange coincidence or confluence of different parts of our lives, be it professional life, personal life, Joe's life, both career and personal. And so I feel like, one of the kind of themes or things that we explore in the story is just how do you balance between these different parts of yourselves or different parts of your story. So I think it also just made sense to keep it kind of like a back and forth passing of the baton.
And for those who might listen to this before they read the piece, why don't we do a little background, just an individual background of where your individual points of view are coming from with this piece, and then that'll obviously make sense as they begin to fold in on one another and braid together.
Right. Joe, I'll let you start.
Yeah, so I'm now just turned 64. I've been a newspaper man my whole professional career, which is now somewhat alarmingly in excess of 40 years. Um, and across those years at the New York Times and later at ProPublica, I was always both intrigued by the possibility of doing work overseas, and also deeply uncertain myself whether I really have the guts and the stones to do that kind of work. And in the spring of 2021, I was no longer associated with any big major news organization. I was on my own and reconnected with an old colleague from the Times, Ian Urbina, who had founded something called the Outlaw Ocean Project, which is a sort of investigative news site dedicated to covering all the mischief and mayhem and marauding that goes on the high seas around the world. And we had a long friendship and professional relationship, and we each admired each other. And he was intrigued by whether I would kind of join up with his new outfit, and he had a reporting trip in mind, which was to do a story sort of investigating the horrors being perpetrated against African migrants trying to make their way to Europe. And it was a very ambitious reporting idea that we would first go to Libya and then on to Niger, and then maybe down into Guinea-Bissau to sort of trace the full route of migrants trying to make their way to Europe and the terrible circumstances they could find themselves when they were often captured and detained. And Libya was the first stop. So for me, at almost 62 years old at that time, it might have been one of my last chances at foreign correspondence, or the chance to do that kind of work, and maybe the chance for me to prove something to myself. So I said yes, and soon enough was on a flight, first to Amsterdam, then to Istanbul, and on into Tripoli. And that's how I wound up there.
And I have had spent almost like a decade overseas, so kind of opposite trajectory in terms of really throwing myself out there and working across Southeast Asia and East Asia, and then France, and a million places doing kind of freelance writing and journalism, making documentary films, opening a restaurant in Vietnam, doing some private intelligence work. I mean, I tried everything and ended up coming back to the United States in 2019. And was supposed to be going to law school and ended up deciding not to do that like a month before classes started, and went back to full-time documentary filmmaking. And so I guess by 2021, when our story kind of begins, I had been working for the last half year or more on a documentary series by Show of Force for HBO, exploring the Iranian hostage crisis that happened in 1979 when the U.S. Embassy was seized and taken hostage for 444 days, kind of as a result of the revolution that had happened and a lot of kind of deep questioning about Iran's relationship with the U.S. So I was busy kind of working as a story producer, researching it, finding characters, connecting with people around the globe who had stories to tell. And then we'd been filming a whole bunch. And that was kind of at the height of COVID. So it was, constant testing and doing all this type of stuff. And Joe reached out to me and was like, hey, I'm going to Libya soon and I need to get this done and that done. And you've been overseas. And so I kind of got enlisted to help him out. And yeah, that's kind of how the story begins, I guess.
Yeah, and not to derail the conversation too much, but I have to ask: this restaurant you opened up in Vietnam, like what was what did you serve?
Oh gosh, I think with all restaurants, there's kind of like a refining of the concept. But we first started as a Korean American dessert parlor. So
Okay.
my boyfriend at the time was a Korean guy who had moved to Vietnam and had helped open up a couple of Korean ice cream. They have a particular type of ice cream called bingsu, which is like a shaved milk ice cream, and it's very popular across Southeast Asia. And so he was like, I want to make one of my own. And then of course I was like, well, let's add some like root beer floats and waffles with ice cream. And the root beer floats were not popular in Vietnam. They're like, what is root beer? So it kind of like refined into more of just a Korean dessert parlor.
And Joe, you were a sports writer for the New York Times for a bit, and then you moved over to the Metro desk when things were with your family at the time were such that moving over to the Metro allowed you to be able to raise your two older daughters at the time while working at the Times. And you talk about coming to foreign correspondence, this thing to go overseas later in life. Maybe you can take us to the headspace of that as this being something of maybe a lot of reporters, kind of a feather in the cap to see, like you said, do you have the stones to do it?
Yeah, I mean, within the sort of peculiar, distinctive hierarchy of the New York Times, working for the foreign desk was always, sort of the pinnacle, and it's where many of the people who would go on to run the paper, had made their bones and won their Pulitzers, and whether that is, Max Frankel or Joe Lelyveld or Bill Keller, who are all successive executive editors of the Times. So the foreign desk was always, the place if you were particularly ambitious, you would want to point yourself at. And, having been a sports writer for a while at the Times, and then having been a Metro reporter for a while at the Times, there was a chance for me to go to the foreign desk. It wasn't a certainty, but there was an opening in the East Africa bureau, which is based in Nairobi. There are certain foreign postings like Paris or Beijing, which have a kind of obvious cachet and appeal, and and come with a relative sense of safety. And then there are some really challenging postings, and East Africa would be among the most challenging. I think you would be responsible for something like a dozen East African countries, Somalia, Sudan, Ethiopia. Many of them one more troubled than the last. And so it would have been a handful. The first time the possibility came up, Lucy and her sister Jane, were still in middle school themselves, I think.
Yeah.
And there was, the idea of living in an armed compound in Nairobi and, roaming around these, dozen East African countries didn't seem like a particularly prudent thing to do or a fair thing to do to the girls. So that opportunity came and went. So in 2021, when I hooked up with Ian Urbina, it was a chance to get a taste of it. Ian and his nonprofit news organization have done some of the most daring reporting, on the planet. Uh, you know, Chinese slave ships, piracy on the high seas, been engaged in chases of, mass polluters around the Arctic Circle. He's been to North Korean waters. Anyway, a pretty intrepid and brave, reporter. And so the challenge, the chance to just like get a sniff of that, a taste of that, felt both appealing and scary, and for me, amounted to a little bit of a reckoning with my own sense of my own personal courage or lack of it.
And to set the record straight, I was all game to go. And I think I was 7th going into 8th grade or something, and I was already like researching schools that I could go to. I was like, what high schools do they have in Nairobi? Though I feel like I remember it being South Africa was the first, Johannesburg or something like that. But I think that speaks to like I had that bug to like go overseas, and I enjoyed challenges quite a bit from a young age.
Yeah, that's wonderful, and and Lucy, like the at least the journalism just through which I'm familiar with you now is like your medium is documentary film, and and this piece proves what a wonderful writer you are as well. At what point did you realize that maybe film was the medium that that appealed to you, if it in fact appeals to you more than any other sort of journalistic
Right.
spur?
I mean, I fell into documentary film quite by accident. I was like fresh out of Reed College, and had always planned to go to law school and wanted to become like a law professor. And I was just doing, a little bit of research work and help for a former New York Times journalist, or I guess he was at the time, but took a sabbatical to write a book. And he had made his name's Tim Golden, and he had made a documentary with Alex Gibney called Taxi to the Dark Side. And so his offices were in Alex Gibney's Jigsaw Productions in New York. And I kind of got recruited into a series about the death penalty in America. And so, yeah, I was never like a big watcher of documentaries growing up, but kind of fell into it and found it to be a really interesting form of writing, because a lot of times you're writing with images, but there's extensive like writing of treatments and scripts, before you even go out and film, which was really interesting. But then I went out to Southeast Asia, and also got kind of recruited into a 2-year project that was a ProPublica project, actually. And I was kind of contributing reporting and research from Vietnam. And then we made a documentary out of that for Frontline. And anyways, I gave a real try at being like a print journalist, and was trying to kind of, report from overseas and from Vietnam, where like, there was no there's no AP there. There was no Reuters. It was kind of like a black hole to a certain extent. Freelance writing, like freelance journalism is pretty brutal. It's like 90% of the time writing
Yeah.
pitches that, don't even get a response from an editor. And then they want, the entire piece to be delivered perfectly with images. And so it kind of was a bit of a jarring experience of like, I really want like a mentor. I want to learn how to tell stories better. And documenting kind of was always there. So, and it's a very, very collaborative process. It takes like really like a village to make 1 hour of anything. So I really appreciate that kind of collaborative aspect of filmmaking.
Yeah, and Joe, given that you and Lucy are are journalists, but bridged by like two distinctly different generations and ecosystems of journalism too. The way you came up is is so different than the way people are coming up in the last 10 years, and certainly now. And what have been maybe some of the conversations you've had about for lack of a better term, like advice to get momentum in this career when it's so tumultuous to get a toehold?
Well, yeah. Although I have to say, I think the young folks who are interested in reporting these days are much more talented and skillful than the people of my generation. And while there's obvious challenges to the industry of for-profit journalism these days, there also have been an abundance of new creations and new ways of telling stories and new, the Atavist itself is a prime example, right? An online magazine that does, high quality, storytelling. Places like that didn't exist, when you were trying to get a job at, who knows, the Concord Monitor in New Hampshire, or, the Roanoke paper in Virginia. I'm actually intimidated by the young people who want to get into the business now because they have skills in data, in social media, in technology, in language. So I'm holding on by my fingertips at this point, and you know, they they have more to offer me than I have to offer them, I think.
I do love this one moment in the Atavist piece that you wrote, Joe. Is you wrote like, when the Times asked me to help conduct in-house seminars on street reporting, I made a point of telling younger reporters that success is often determined before you get out the door. If you're fatalistic about getting what you need, failure awaits. If you force yourself to believe that an improbable reporting coup could happen, often as not it does. Corny maybe, but also true, at least in my experience.
Yeah, I mean, look, there are some, eternal truths that, if you're going to be a good reporter, are, as applicable today as they were, 50 years ago. But, there are a whole lot of dirty little secrets in the world of journalism as well. And one of them is that, you know, if you're if you're sitting in a newsroom, and even a newsroom as accomplished and full of resources as the New York Times, and a big story breaks, there's more conflict in people's heads than you might imagine about, like, do I want in on this, or would I love this particular challenge to pass me by, right? Because um, and so I can remember when the bombing of the federal building in Oklahoma City happened. It was a huge news event, and the entire newsroom was, in an uproar of excitement and obligation, and they were recruiting people, to get on a plane. The publisher had commissioned his own private plane to fly people out to Oklahoma City, and all you had to do was put your hand up, and you could get to go. And there were fewer hands put up right away than I think our own mythology of brave and intrepid and aggressive reporters would lead us to believe. And so I think that advice I would give younger people back then about street reporting, or whatever, there's something of the same element there, right? Is like, hey, can you run out on this quadruple homicide in the Bronx, whatever, tonight? get us some, victim material, and see if you can find out more on the cop who was involved, or that's a daunting thing, and and to do it, at a moment's notice, and you can go one of two ways. One is which, oh fuck, how am I ever gonna get anything? This is gonna be, or like, okay, strap it on, let's go. Um, I always find something, whatever. Hit, get in your car and get to the Bronx. But it's more conflicted than I think we'd like people to believe.
So Lucy, when you started on the Atavist piece with Joe, how did let's go to the pitch. How did the pitch look to this when you were looking to let's co-produce this piece?
I mean, I think it was more Joe pitching the story idea to me, and being, are you game to try this? And then I think it was first like, I don't I was maybe a little more hesitant about, whether it would work or how much I had to say. And so I think between Joe and I, we both felt like, well, one, we should write this thing out first, the whole thing, and just see if there's something good there. I mean, the process was a little bit like Joe was like, okay, great. Well, like, you go write up your stuff and I'll go write up my stuff and we'll just send it to each other. And I was like, no prompts? Like, what are the themes we're going to explore here? Like, I need some inspiration and motivation. And Joe was like, I never had to tell my reporters that. They just went out and wrote the story and weren't, too, I guess, moralizing about their own work before, like, going out and seeing what the story was. I was like, I'm not one of your reporters, but I'll try. So I went and just wrote up kind of a long personal story of my experience and tried to think about, chapters or good places to stop. I think we had from the beginning kind of thought we should try doing this kind of braided narrative. I always love playing around with structure, story structure. I don't like starting at the very beginning and just going linear all the time. I love having kind of Rashomon effect sometimes, switching perspectives and telling the same story over again. So I think we were both very game from the beginning to see if we could do kind of a fun swapping of voices in the piece. So yeah, I like wrote up a whole thing and sent it to Joe. I feel like Joe, I was always the first to deliver the piece, and then he would come back with like, okay, this is what I have. And then we just kind of started shaping it and then giving each other, some notes on where we could push things further. For someone who's used to relying upon visuals and audio to sometimes really ground the story in the moment. My writing, I think, was a little bit less like immediate, and it was this moment at this time of day, and the cicadas and all, these like little details of the immediate experience, I think, was actually lacking from my writing in the beginning. So Joe gave me some editorial advice. And yeah, we just kind of drafted it until we felt it was good enough to send out. And I think it was kind of, the pitch was like, read this, and if you think it's good, let's talk.
Yeah, I mean, I think Act Two was, it was Lucy's first burst of writing that persuaded me that the story really might have promise. It's actually was an early version of what is the introductory sort of chapter of the piece that's in the Atavist, and she just struck a very, I thought, effective and conversational style of you know, that was, a little bit playful and a little bit sarcastic and a little bit just a very good kind of scene setting. That really convinced me, like, oh, this might actually work and be of interest to people. In many ways, I had the much easier writing assignment, right? Four of us were abducted and held in Libya, and all I really had to do was tell, what by definition was a fairly, I think, unusual and compelling, sequence of terrible events, um, and with a straight, kind of narrative timeline. So I definitely had the easier assignment throughout.
I think some people might argue that you had the far more difficult task because it was so traumatic on your end that you have to revisit those moments. And to hear you call it like you're like, I had the less demanding assignment. It's like there's a maybe that was a way for you to detach a little bit to make it a bit easier to approach.
Yeah, I mean, my whole relationship to both the events in Libya as they happened, and and since has been, one of relative, calm both in the moment and then afterward. And again, I think you're probably right. It's probably some kind of trick of the brain or the heart to, one, initially get through some terrible events, and then, later on to process them. And I hadn't told the story of what happened to many people prior to this. You know, I don't think I had even told it to Lucy. And I was to this moment, and we'll see what kind of reception the story gets. To this moment, it's awkward. Will people read it and see it as, like, I don't know, self-indulgent or self-important, or will they read it and have just a human healthy reaction to a fairly remarkable story of dark coincidence and a kind of imperfect but durable relationship between a father and a daughter. I hope they do, but you're pretty self-conscious. And but now that we've gone ahead and written 15,000 words or whatever, I think we made a commitment that that we were going to be okay, kind of undressing ourselves a little bit.
I mean, I don't mean to speak for you, Joe, but at least my own experience as a writer, there's a difference between like writing something and then having it read by others. And I think for writers, writing is can be a very personal process of just like processing and thinking through a moment or trying to capture or understand your feelings at the time, regardless of whether it'll be read by others or not. But that is a strong motivation and impetus and almost inspiration for writing. Part of what was hard for me writing this was like, how do I make a story in which every day I'm spending 18 hours or 16 hours working religiously on a job that I'm doing that kind of like doesn't have that much to do with Joe's story. I don't know how to make like 16-hour shoot days interesting to others. There wasn't a lot of time for me to process anything or even feel much of anything. And I think kind of as a producer and as somebody who's done a lot of work overseas in kind of challenging situations, you kind of go into work mode and like, how do I solve this and take care of things? And, I was like, I don't know how interested readers will be in hearing me be like, okay, so I spent 16 hours that day, moving cameras around and getting crew to do this. And then for like, an hour and a half at night, at 3 a.m. in the hotel, finally thinking about what Joe needed and what I could do and all of that. So that was kind of my challenge.
Yeah, Joe, you had brought up this how readers might accept it and the reaction on that end, and there are always I guess a couple approaches when you put out a piece of this nature or any nature where at one point maybe don't care what readers think about it, and that but then there's another part like, oh, you want to say like, do people like it? Do how are they going to respond to this? And for for you as a writer, do, to what extent do you put a lot of weight in just the reader reaction part of it, just for to make sure you're on the right pace or for your ego satisfaction, or do you not care at all?
Oh, I care more than it's even, safe to say. You know, I mean, I'd like my answer to be, some tough guy answer like, I don't give a shit, I write my truth and whatever.
Yeah.
I think, and I'm hardly distinctive in this, but we might as well be honest. I think we all crave, a response that satisfies our vanity and, you know, but that is, that's a substantial and ever-present desire, and I would have to be honest about that. That said, I think there are other simultaneous desires that you hold, which is, depending on the kind of piece you're doing, one that it'll have some impact, particularly when you're telling other people's stories, that you do justice to those stories, and that those people's truths are received by the reading public, in a way that is of some consequence. So there are both legitimate and less flattering desires you go into any kind of publication of a story feeling. But you know the most honest answer is there's a whole lot of ego investment in it, whether you're fully honest with yourself or with the public about that.
I feel like I'm maybe more conscientious than Joe. I'm always like, I just don't know how interesting this is going to be to other people. Should we really write it? And I think Joe um, was really like, let's just give it a try. Maybe it's coming from the documentary film world and the entertainment world, where a lot is put by like how many viewers did it have and how pacing is so important. Like, did you lose people within the first 5 minutes? I think there's a lot of concern with that within documentary. I know it's there in writing, but I don't know. I just always think that my own story and life story is really not that compelling. um, so I guess I was, for this piece particularly, was from the beginning a little concerned about whether it had any value or interest to others. And I'm still nervous about it. It hasn't, I don't know what the reaction's going to be. But I think one thing that felt, that put those kind of fears to rest a little bit was if we just stay true to our story, um, and to I think one of the more interesting and fruitful and evocative parts of this story is really the relationship between Joe and I, and this father-daughter relationship. And so I think that's kind of, while it's unique to us, those relationships are also universal. And so I think, that got me a little bit over this hump of whether it's going to be interesting or compelling to others. So
But just even to come at it from just a purely clinical point of view, right? I mean, I've been doing this now for 40 years or whatever, and become a pretty good judge of, what's a good story. And, for some of the stories that I've been a part of that have had, the greatest, public reception, they all have like just almost a singular aspect of it that carries the entire thing. We did a story. I was an editor on a story at ProPublica called "The Unbelievable Story of Rape," and wound up winning the Pulitzer Prize for explanatory reporting, and became a Netflix series, 8-part Netflix series. It was a real sensation. But and it was but the single fact at the heart of it that made it what it was that a young woman had reported being raped, was disbelieved. That happens all the time, whatever. Not only was she disbelieved, but she was then prosecuted for having filed a false complaint. And that moved it into, in the America's ugly and, seemingly endless variety of stories about rape and misconduct, or like that, put it in a different category. I happened to write a story while at ProPublica about a cop who was fired from the force for his involvement in a fatal shooting of a young African American kid. His fault was not that he shot the kid; he was fired for not having shot. Um, so, again, in America's endless catalog of police killing stories, that put it in a different category. This story for the Atavist has, at its heart, a pretty extraordinary coincidence, right? That a daughter is working on a series in which she's spending day after day talking to former hostages, former hostage takers, families of those taken, whatever, about the experience of their loved one being held overseas. And then her dad goes missing in the course of it, and is held hostage for almost a week in Libya. Like, that just doesn't happen every day. And and putting all concerns about our personal stories or what we do, like, that's a hook that's gonna work, I think, almost every time. That would be the kind of cynical clinical view of why you might believe that people will be interested in the story. And whether the reaction is positive or negative, whether it gets a million reads or none, I think it's been a good experience for Lucy and I to have done. And there's going to always be the satisfaction of that, whatever the public makes of it. Like all parent-child experiences, it's a mix of tension and frustration and love and trust, and that's fundamentally, I think, a good thing for Lucy and I to have done together.
Yeah, you kind of took that question out of my mouth. I was gonna just say that, just as the pair of you doing this, what the experience was like to be able to co-author something of this nature, just as what it we speak nothing of writer, journalist to journalist, but father to daughter and daughter to father.
I mean, I wonder if I scarred Joe early on with that, story of in I think it was third grade, his kind of like rewriting of editing of one of my homework pieces, and me being, I think it was quite a disagreement, verbal blow up or something, and I was like, "You're not helping with anything ever again." So maybe I've scarred him in that way, but I think he was pretty insistent upon me writing my sections kind of on my own and not over editing me, which it sometimes I was like, I want more, like give me more feelings or material, themes, concepts, like whatever to work with. And so it was sometimes kind of like brutal to really just like sit down and like make myself write this thing. But I think in the end, I really appreciated that, I think he really does respect my writing and my voice. And so I think in that way, we're pretty good collaborators. And, when I was off in Vietnam and Thailand and Cambodia and whatnot, writing, freelance stories for, Vice or all these different publications, and didn't have really much of an editor, I always turned to Joe and was like, hey, can you take a look at this? And so I think we have kind of developed a kind of like also more professional relationship when it comes to that. And yet, of course, we have like those father daughter moments, or those moments you have with close family members where you're like, you are so annoying right now. And the good thing about families, it's like really hard to shake them. So I think we allow for each other to like have our moments of annoyance and then move forward, and it kind of like just is part of the whole thing. So I think
And
it's been a great experience.
and whether it's a father daughter writing tandem, or just two journalists trying to co-write a piece, whatever, what they most need is not each other's feedback, but they need a third party, independent. And Sayward was really, I think, awesome. She was taken by the story from the first time she read the first draft of it. She had very clear ideas about how it could be made better. She had specific requests of the two of us, and I think having that kind of excited and enthusiastic referee step into it was vital, and will always be the case in any kind of jointly written piece. So I'm very grateful to her for her work.
There's a scene in the Godfather when like Don Corleone, like he realizes that Michael did something that pulls him into their underground, and there's a look of anguish on his face, like, oh my god, like you were supposed to not be in this, you were supposed to be the one who got out. And I so Joe, Lucy becomes a journalist, you're a journalist. Was there that moment of anguish? You're like, I thought I wanted better for you. I wanted but now you're in the mud of this journalistic career now.
Well, first let me begin with a confession, which is, despite having been a Brooklyn boy from my birth, and having kind of you know fronted myself as some kind of Brooklyn tough guy or whatever, from back in the day, I've never seen The Godfather. So
Same here. I've never seen The Godfather.
but I know enough about it to easily imagine the scene. But and the answer is yes. Lucy's a quite brilliant woman, and I'm going to make her uncomfortable or whatever. But as I say in the piece, she's 10 times smarter than me. She wrote a fascinating thesis paper when she graduated from Reed, about the law. I'm the son of a lawyer. She's the granddaughter of a lawyer. I had a rooting interest in her becoming, young and legal prodigy, and eventual professor, and so, you know, that just because she really, I think liked the subject of the law, and was recognized by professors and whatever as somebody with a distinct degree of promise to, enrich that world. Um, so, but to have instead entered the world of storytelling, there's nothing wrong with that. Like I said, well, I'll steal an old line. Lucy's heard this a number of times, but so one of my favorite colleagues at the New York Times was a big city columnist, Jim Dwyer, who had written a column for first Newsday and then the Daily News, and then came to the New York Times. And he had a great line, and I've enjoyed stealing it since I heard it, which is that there are three great inextinguishable human desires: the need for food, the need for sex, and the need for stories. Helping satisfy that, humankind's endless appetite and need for stories of all kinds. That's good, fun, noble work that is its own kind of contribution to, a better future. So, spending a life in the world of storytelling, that's an okay outcome for my kid.
Very nice. Well, as I bring these conversations down for a landing, I love asking the guests, and this is great. We have two, for a recommendation of some kind for the listeners. And that can just be anything you're excited about. It could be reading, it could be movies, it could be a brand of socks you're particularly tickled about. So I'd extend that to the two of you. Like, what might you recommend to the listeners out there?
Oh gosh.
Well, I can go first if you want to buy time. Look, so and it's somewhat related to. So when I got back from the ordeal in Libya, it was a very strange kind of reentry, and one of the remarkable things was you actually didn't want to see your family right away. That you would think that would be the most normal and instinctive reaction, but I actually didn't. I needed some kind of space to, get my legs a little bit. And I watched a show that was done. I think it was 4 seasons, whatever. But it's called Rectify, and you can find it on one of the streaming services. And it's, for me, was among the most profound pieces of TV that I've watched about the experience of sort of wrongfully convicted on death row, who then re-enter the world once their case is, overturned and vacated. Anyway, maybe it was just something about my state of mind at the time, but I found it just an exquisite piece of work. So the show is called Rectify, and I'd recommend that for anyone, particularly those emerging from a Libyan jail cell out there.
I'm trying to think of something. I mean, two things come to mind. One is recent, one is not so recent, but stays with me and is kind of relevant to writing this piece. The recent thing is I enjoy Amtrak trains in the summer, and I know there's been a lot of horrible flights that I've been dealing with, and I know a lot of people are like, trying to get away in the summer, and I just have to say, Amtrak trains, they're so nice. I would just suggest that as a life hack for the summer, avoiding the horrors of flying right now. If we're wanting something more creative of a recommendation, back in 2021, so at the year that this kind of story takes place with Joe and I watched one of my favorite documentary filmmakers, Robert Greene. He came out with a documentary on Netflix called Procession, and it's all of his work is kind of like hybrid between scripted and documentary, and really complex, interesting story structure. And I remember watching it and being really inspired, and I think maybe even kind of encouraged me in the writing with Joe to lean into trying what could be a very difficult kind of narrative. So yeah, it's a great documentary. It's called Procession by Robert Greene.
Oh, fantastic. Well, Lucy and Joe, this was so great to get to talk to you about this piece and your approach to it. And I just want to commend you on a job well done, and thanks for coming on the show to talk about it and some other things.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Say word. Lucy and Joe. Nice. Great talk. Great chat. You can visit magazine.atavist.com to read the piece and or subscribe. $25 a year. Not bad when you really think about it. How many things are you subscribed to? So many creators out there are asking you for a few bucks a month. I do. Patreon.com/CNFpod. But so do like a million other people I know who are on Substack or be it Allie Ward of Ologies, and she's on Patreon. And then there are people who haven't even really built an audience, and they start a newsletter, and they're like already, hey, pay for this so I can do my work. And it's like, they haven't done the hard work of building a base. They're going to be very disappointed. If I upgraded to paid for everyone I read, I'd go bankrupt. I suspect you would too, so I wonder what makes you choose to pay into one versus another. It could be as simple as kindness, or it could be something else. I mean, this podcast will always come out on Fridays, whether people pay for it or not. I mean, you pay for it one way or another, be it time or money, and people who do both, awesome. High fives. I hope to offer more one-on-one stuff, some FaceTime. I think that helps. I think people really enjoyed that. It's just a matter of finding something of an objective party who has talked to hundreds of people about doing this kind of thing, and listening, hearing you out, maybe offer a little pointer here and there. And you want to talk about a bargain. If I had a CFO, they'd be like, you got to cut that shit out. but I don't. So here I am. What are we going to talk about this week? I suppose I can talk about some book stuff. I haven't talked about book stuff in a while. And you know what I've been riffing on in my journals, a la John Steinbeck, is what's been consuming my days of late is the feeling of, like, am I doing enough in a given day? And sometimes it just never feels like enough. I don't even know what that is. But I think this week especially has been pretty good. I've spoken with, long conversations with 5 people. And then when I say long conversation, it's like upwards of an hour or more. I usually cap it off at an hour and then want to circle back with people. And then found some other people, some intermediaries who put me in touch with people. So that's really good. That's good. And I think that is enough. It's hard to tell sometimes. Like, I'm reaching the bottom of the bucket for sure of the written record on Prefontaine. I must be in the bottom quarter, if not lower. So that leaves me with tracking down more people to interview, interviewing past interviewees again, circling back for more detail, cleaning up the transcripts. Oh, gosh. I have more than 60 transcripts, probably pushing closer to 70, and I think I need to clean up about 40 of those. Ugh. I mean, it's not as bad as actual transcribing, but it's still a slog. I also need to write. I've been in a slump of late, haven't had the momentum, and I need to lay down more road, find out where those potholes are, find out what feels thin, when I know maybe a particular area could benefit from some more bulking. You want to know these shortcomings when you're 8.5 to 6 months from deadline versus 1 month. Be like, oh shit, I got to circle back to 30 people because this feels bad and I've only got a month to do it. I don't want to do that. I've written probably in the neighborhood of 10,000 words. So that's not terrible, but we got to start the hustle. In terms of the story, I really think the best tool is a timeline. Mine isn't as fleshed out as I would like it to be. So I need to really comb through my omnibus spreadsheet of more than 1,000 articles that I have very detailed notes about. Just find those big beats. Ask myself, what do they mean? Why are they worth digging into deeper? Thinking about structure too. I don't think I have the chops to pull off what I really want to do, but it's to treat this book like The Last Dance docuseries on Michael Jordan. I think I cracked the code as to how I could do it, but I don't know if it's smart. And I suspect my editor will be like, please don't. But that said, that Last Dance element, that's going to be a chapter unto itself. That's sort of a big block through which you could potentially hang the entire narrative. It's going to be its own thing. So I think I can experiment by breaking it up into chunklets that float over the top of the entire Prefontaine story and why he still matters, why he's still relevant today. When those beats are measured out, then the research and the reporting becomes far more targeted and far more efficient. Then you can go back to someone and you just talk for maybe 20 minutes instead of 2 hours. And you just go right to the heart of what you want to get. So anyway, that's kind of where we're getting, and as we're still trying to find new people, more people to talk to. But that's where we're at. And that's where we're going. Okay? Good. I hope you're good. I hope your writing's going well. And we've come to the end, so I hope what you will do is stay wild. And if you can do, interview. See ya.